Riverfall was a city of shadows, where power was taken, never given, where the streets belonged to the ones ruthless enough to rule them. Naomi Carter had learned that truth the hard way, tending to the battered and broken bodies that came through the doors of St. Jude's Clinic every night. The neighborhood was suffocating under the iron grip of the Black Cobras, a gang that didn't just control the streets, they owned fear itself. Their business was protection, their currency was violence, and their victims were the ones who couldn't pay. Every night, Naomi stitched up the consequences of their power, saw the desperation in the eyes of those who had nowhere else to turn, and every night she told herself she wouldn't get involved. That was before Henry Vargas. He came in just before closing, wheeling himself through the clinic doors with the quiet dignity of a man who had long since stopped expecting kindness. The bruises on his face were fresh, his bottom lip split, his knuckles raw from a fight he hadn't won. Naomi met his eyes, dark and defiant, and she didn't need to ask what had happened. She already knew. Henry had always refused to pay the Cobras, had spent his life making it clear he wouldn't bow to anyone. Even when the accident took his legs, even when prison took his years, he never let them take his pride. That night, they had tried again. This time, they had left him on the pavement. "You should have called an ambulance," she said, pressing antiseptic to his wounds, watching him wince but never complain. "And have them take me somewhere I can't afford?" His voice was rough, edged with something that sounded almost like amusement. "I'd rather bleed on my own terms." She knew better than to argue. Instead, she finished her work in silence, wrapping his hands, cleaning his wounds, and ignoring the rage simmering just beneath her skin. When she left the clinic an hour later, the streets were almost empty, the kind of emptiness that wasn't safe, the kind that meant something was about to happen. She spotted them before she heard them. 3 men standing too still beneath the broken glow of a street lamp, their voices low, their attention locked onto the figure in the wheelchair in front of them. "Henry." Naomi didn't hesitate. She crossed the street before logic could stop her, before fear could remind her that this wasn't her fight, before she could talk herself into walking away. The first man was laughing, leaning in close, one hand gripping the handle of Henry's wheelchair, his other hand tapping a roll of cash against his palm. "Last chance, old man," he was saying. "Next time, we ain't asking." Naomi moved fast. She grabbed the wrist holding the money, twisting it hard enough to wrench a pained shout from him, using his own momentum to slam him against the nearest wall. The second man reacted too slow, barely had time to register what was happening before her elbow drove into his ribs, knocking the wind from his lungs. The third came at her, swinging, expecting her to back down. He was bigger, stronger, but she had trained for men like him. She ducked, sidestepped, and sent a brutal kick into the back of his knee, dropping him to the pavement with a single strike. Silence followed. The first man groaned, trying to push himself up, but Naomi pressed a boot to his chest, pinning him down. "This is how it's going to work," she said, her voice calm, steady, lethal. "You walk away. You leave him alone. Or next time, you won't get back up." They scrambled to their feet, humiliated, furious, but they didn't argue. They knew a fight they couldn't win when they saw one. One by one, they disappeared into the night. Henry exhaled, shaking his head as he adjusted his grip on the wheels. "You just made yourself a problem." Naomi didn't respond. She already knew. The message came at 2:14 a.m. A blocked number, a simple text glowing in the darkness of her room. "You made a mistake. This isn't your war." Morning brought another visitor. Detective Callum Dorn stood outside the clinic, arms crossed, face unreadable, the weight of too many cases and too many dead bodies etched into the hard lines of his jaw. "What did you do, Carter?" She didn't answer. But they both knew the truth. She had started a war. The fire swallowed Henry Vargas's home in minutes, flames rising high into the night, turning brick and wood into smoldering ruins. By the time the sirens screamed through the streets of Riverfall, by the time the firemen battled the inferno, by the time the neighbors gathered in silence, staring at the destruction, it was too late. Henry never made it out. Naomi stood among the onlookers, fists clenched, her breath ragged with fury, the heat of the blaze searing her skin, but it was nothing compared to the fire igniting inside her. She knew who did this. The Cobras didn't leave debts unpaid, didn't let humiliation go unpunished. This was their answer, their message, their warning. They expected her to be afraid. They expected her to back down. They expected her to break. They were wrong. She spent the next 48 hours in the clinic, stitching up wounds with hands that ached to break something, working through the grief with every measured breath, every controlled movement. But inside, a storm raged. This wasn't just about Henry anymore. This was about every person who walked into her clinic with bruises they couldn't explain, every broken rib, every fractured jaw, every shattered life that no one cared enough to fight for. She had spent years fixing their wounds, sending them back into the same cycle, knowing they had nowhere else to go. Not anymore. Naomi Carter wasn't just going to fight back. She was going to burn the cobras to the ground. The first step was information. She started with the patients, the ones who had been forced to pay, the ones who had tried to run, the ones who had lost everything to the cobra's greed. She asked about their collection routes, the enforcers, the drop points, the weak spots. She listened to the patterns, mapped out the streets in her head, traced the flow of money. And what she found made her blood run cold. This wasn't just a street gang preying on the weak. This was a system. The money didn't stop at the cobras. It went higher. The police, the city officials, the people who were supposed to protect Riverfall, they were all part of it. She moved carefully, speaking in hushed tones, meeting in back alleys, collecting details like weapons. The streets whispered her name, stories spreading faster than she could contain them. The nurse who stood up to the cobras. The woman who took down 3 men without breaking a sweat. The fire that wouldn't die. And with the whispers came the warnings. It started with shadows that lingered too long outside the clinic, cars that moved too slow past her apartment, the unmistakable weight of being watched. Then came the message. A note slipped under her door, written in the same blocky script as the text she had received days before. Walk away while you still can. She tore it in half. Dorn showed up the next night, leaning against the doorway of the clinic, arms crossed, expression grim. You really don't know how to let things go, do you? Naomi wiped her hands on a cloth, tossing it aside. They burned a man alive, Dorn. I'm not letting that go. He exhaled, shaking his head. Red Mercer doesn't like loose ends. You've become one. Red Mercer. The name she had been waiting to hear. The man who sat at the head of the snake, the one pulling the strings, the one who controlled every piece of the cobra's empire. He had sent the warning. He had ordered the fire. He had killed Henry Vargas. Naomi looked up, meeting Dorn's gaze, unflinching. Good. Because I don't like him either. The first explosion shattered the windows, sending glass spraying across the clinic floor like jagged rain, the air thick with the sudden heat of fire. Naomi barely had time to react before the second Molotov cocktail crashed through the front entrance, igniting the waiting area in an instant, flames licking up the walls, swallowing the cheap plastic chairs, consuming the stacks of medical files and supplies. The screams came next. Patients, staff, people who had come here for safety now running for their lives as the inferno spread. Smoke filled Naomi's lungs as she grabbed an elderly woman from the floor, dragging her toward the back exit, ignoring the embers singeing her skin. The heat was unbearable, a living thing, roaring and crackling, hungry for destruction. She heard sirens in the distance, but she knew it was too late. The clinic, her clinic, was gone. Outside, under the flickering glow of the flames, people stood in shock, coughing, wiping soot from their faces. Naomi's pulse pounded as she scanned the street, her fists clenching at the sight of a black SUV disappearing around the corner. This wasn't just a warning. This was a message. The Cobras weren't playing anymore. They were making their move. Hours later, after the fire department had done what they could, after the police had taken their statements with the usual indifference, Naomi stood in what remained of the clinic, the air still thick with smoke, the walls blackened, the smell of burnt medicine and chemicals coating her throat. Dr. Corwin Henshaw, the head of the clinic, paced in front of her, his face lined with exhaustion, his white coat stained with ash. This has to stop, he said, his voice firm, but laced with something dangerously close to fear. Naomi, listen to me. You can't fight people like this. They don't have rules. They don't have limits. They will burn everything you care about to the ground just to make a point, She met his gaze, unwavering. Then they'll have to try harder. Henshaw exhaled sharply, shaking his head. Damn it, Naomi, you think you're invincible? You think this is just some noble fight? You're going to end up like Henry Vargas. Or worse. Then at least I'll go down fighting. She turned away from him, from the wreckage, from the weight of his words pressing down on her shoulders. She had already lost too much. She wasn't about to back down now. The offer came that night. She found Red Mercer waiting outside her apartment, leaning against the hood of a sleek black car, a cigarette dangling from his fingers. He was taller than she expected, broad-shouldered, his suit sharp despite the casual way he wore it. His eyes, cold and calculating, scanned her with amusement, as if she were an interesting puzzle he was considering solving. "You've been busy," he said, his voice smooth, unhurried. "I respect that. I really do. But I'm here to offer you a way out." Naomi crossed her arms, keeping her stance firm. "I don't need one." Mercer smirked, taking a slow drag from his cigarette. "That's where you're wrong. See, I like order. I like things to run a certain way. You're a disruption. And I can't have that. But I'm a reasonable man. So here's what I'm offering. You walk away. Leave Riverfall. Start fresh somewhere else. And in return? I forget this little vendetta of yours ever happened." She held his gaze, feeling the weight of his words, the implied threat beneath the politeness. He wasn't just offering her a deal. He was giving her a final chance. Naomi stepped closer, just enough to make sure he saw the fire in her eyes. "I don't run." Mercer sighed, shaking his head with a slow chuckle. "That's what Henry said too." He flicked his cigarette to the ground, crushing it beneath his heel before stepping into his car. The door shut with a finality that sent a chill down her spine. Naomi stood there long after the taillights disappeared, her fists clenched, her heart pounding. She had made her choice. Now she just had to survive it. The threats started small, spray-painted warnings on the clinic's charred walls, slashed tires, broken windows in her apartment. Then they escalated. A nurse she worked with found a dead rat in her locker, its body stuffed with a note, "Quit, or you're next." A patient Naomi had helped just days ago was found beaten in an alley, his jaw shattered, his hand twisted at an unnatural angle. The message was clear: this isn't your fight. Stay out of it. But Naomi had already crossed the line. There was no turning back now. She needed leverage. Something big. Something that could turn the tide before it swallowed her whole. That's when she set her sights on Tide Briggs, Mercer's enforcer, the man who handled the Cobra's most brutal work. He was the key to their operations, the one who made sure money kept flowing and bodies kept dropping when orders needed to be enforced. If she could get to him, she could rip the Cobras apart from the inside. The plan was simple. She followed his routine, learned his habits. Every Thursday night, he met with someone in a rundown warehouse near the docks, a place where the Cobras stored contraband and ran their underground fights. Naomi staked out the area, watching, waiting for the right moment. When he arrived, she was ready. She moved fast, striking from the shadows, slamming a pipe against the back of his knee before he could react. He stumbled, cursing, but he wasn't just some street thug. He was trained. His elbow shot back, cracking against her ribs, knocking the air from her lungs. She barely had time to dodge his next attack, a vicious hook aimed straight at her jaw. She rolled, sweeping his legs, but he recovered too quickly, grabbing her by the collar and slamming her against the rusted metal wall. Pain exploded through her back as he pressed his forearm against her throat, his breath hot with fury. "You've got guts," he growled, eyes burning with rage. "But you're out of your league." Naomi gritted her teeth, twisting her wrist to pull the knife from her sleeve. She drove it into his shoulder, the blade sinking deep. Tide roared, staggering back, giving her just enough room to tear something from his jacket, a small USB drive. That was all she needed. She kicked him hard in the stomach, sending him crashing against a pile of crates, and ran. Her body screamed in protest, every muscle aching, blood seeping from the gash along her side. She barely made it back to her car before collapsing behind the wheel, hands shaking as she pressed the drive against her palm. She didn't know what was on it yet, but if Tide carried it, it was valuable. Dorn decrypted the files in his cramped, cluttered office, his fingers flying over the keyboard, face illuminated by the glow of the screen. Naomi stood behind him, arms crossed, trying to ignore the throbbing pain in her ribs. The seconds stretched into eternity before he finally exhaled sharply, leaning back in his chair. "This isn't just gang business," he muttered. "The Cobras aren't working alone." Naomi frowned, stepping closer. "What do you mean?" Dorn clicked a file, pulling up documents, bank transfers, hidden accounts. At the center of it all was a name she hadn't expected, one that sent a cold shiver down her spine. "Congressman Daniel Olton," Dorn said, his voice grim. "He's the one pulling the strings." Naomi's pulse pounded. She had been prepared for a war with the Cobras. But this was bigger than she ever imagined. Dorn's expression was grim as he leaned forward, his fingers tapping restlessly against the desk. "Naomi, Olton isn't just a politician. He's the cornerstone of corruption in Riverfall. He doesn't just use the Cobras, he owns them." His words landed like a punch to the gut. Naomi clenched her fists, trying to process the weight of it. Olton wasn't just benefiting from crime, he was orchestrating it, pulling the strings behind the city's most violent gang, using them as his enforcers to silence opposition and tighten his grip on power. The police weren't blind. They were complicit. Every time someone pushed back against his policies, protested the treatment of their communities, or tried to expose the truth, the Cobras were sent in to handle it. Broken bones, burned down businesses, vanished activists, it all traced back to Olton. Naomi's fight was no longer just against the gang. It was against the system itself. She knew what she had to do. Evidence wasn't enough if it rotted in the shadows. She needed exposure, needed people to see the truth. If she could get the files into the hands of the press, Olton's web of lies would collapse under public scrutiny. She met with a journalist, Daniel Fry, one of the last independent voices in Riverfall. They spoke in hushed voices in the back of a near-empty diner, Fray's eyes darting toward the door every few minutes, paranoia already creeping in. "You don't understand what you're stepping into," he muttered, scrolling through the decrypted files on his laptop. "This isn't just corruption. This is an empire." Naomi's pulse pounded, but she held firm. "Then let's burn it down." Fry agreed to run the story, promising to publish everything within 24 hours. It was the break she needed. For the first time in weeks, Naomi felt something close to hope. But it didn't last. The next morning, Fry was gone. His phone disconnected, his apartment emptied overnight. No struggle, no signs of forced entry. Just gone. Naomi stared at the blank screen, bile rising in her throat. This wasn't a coincidence. This was a warning. Then came the message. Her phone buzzed, and for a moment, she didn't want to look. But she forced herself. "You were given a chance to walk away. Now it will hurt." A chill ran through her spine. This was different. Before, they had threatened, intimidated, tried to scare her off. Now, they weren't making empty threats. They were coming for her. And this time, they wouldn't miss. The announcement came through the city's news channels like a hammer striking cold steel. Official closure of the clinic due to sanitary violations and failure to meet city regulations. The words were hollow, a cover for the truth everyone in Riverfall already knew. The clinic wasn't shut down because it was unsafe. It was shut down because it had become a battleground, a symbol of resistance, and Olton wanted it erased. Naomi stood in front of the scorched remains, fists clenched as she listened to the voices of people she had spent years helping, their frustration boiling over into fear. They had nowhere to go now, no place to seek help without worrying about a knife at their throat or a debt they couldn't pay. The Cobras had won this round, and Olton had made sure to tighten his grip on the city even further. Dr. Henshaw didn't even say goodbye. Naomi arrived at his apartment that evening to find it empty, the door left slightly ajar as if he'd left in a hurry. A single note sat on the kitchen counter: "You can't fight ghosts, Naomi. Get out while you still can." She stared at it, bile rising in her throat. Another ally gone. She was used to being alone, but this was different. It wasn't just loneliness. It was isolation, forced and brutal, meant to break her down before they finished her off. But she wasn't backing down. Dorn was waiting outside when she left the building, his expression unreadable as he leaned against his car. "You're still standing," he said, his voice rough with exhaustion. "Didn't think you'd make it this far?" Naomi met his gaze, her jaw tight. "Neither did they." He studied her for a long moment before nodding. "Then let's stop playing defense." They worked through the night, laying out every piece of information they had, every connection, every weak link. If Olton wanted her gone, if Mercer wanted her dead, they needed a reason to come out of the shadows. Naomi had an idea, a desperate one, but it was the only move left on the board. "We stage an attack," she said, watching Dorn's reaction carefully. "We make it look like I'm dead or on the verge of it. They'll want confirmation. They'll come out to see it themselves." Dorn exhaled sharply, rubbing a hand over his face. "You really think they're that reckless?" Naomi's lips twisted into something bitter. "Mercer is arrogant. Olton is cautious. One of them will take the bait." Dorn hesitated for only a second before nodding. The plan was set in motion. Naomi would be seen leaving a secure location, alone, at night. A staged assault, fake blood, just enough evidence for the Cobras to think their job was done. Dorn would track the response, see who moved first. It should have worked. But they weren't fast enough. Hours later, Naomi's phone buzzed. No number. Just a message. "Your detective was easier to take than you." Her blood turned to ice. Dorn was gone. The Cobras had him. And now, they were playing a new game. Naomi knew it was a trap the moment she stepped into the warehouse, but hesitation wasn't an option. Dorn's life depended on her speed, her precision, and her ability to stay ahead of the Cobras just long enough to get him out. The dimly lit corridors smelled of sweat, blood, and gasoline, a den of predators waiting for their prey to make one wrong move. Her heartbeat was steady, controlled, her breathing measured as she slipped past two armed guards, moving like a shadow between rusted crates and abandoned machinery. She found Dorn tied to a chair in the center of the main floor, his face bruised, blood trickling from his temple. His head lifted slightly, and when his eyes met hers, she saw it, the warning, the silent plea. She turned too late. Bright lights flooded the space, blinding her for a split second. Heavy boots echoed from all directions as armed men emerged from the darkness, guns raised, forming a wall of muscle and firepower around them. And then, from the back of the room, a slow, deliberate clap cut through the tension. Red Mercer stepped forward, his presence suffocating, his cold, knowing grin carved deep into his scarred face. He looked at Naomi like a scientist observing an insect under a microscope. "You really thought you could just walk in and take him?" His voice was smooth, almost amused, but beneath it was a coiled serpent ready to strike. Naomi didn't move, her fists clenched, every muscle in her body coiled for action. "You made a mistake coming here, girl," Mercer continued, circling her like a vulture. "You think killing me will change anything? You think this city belongs to me? I'm just a soldier. The empire you want to burn doesn't even know your name." His words were poison, but Naomi refused to drink. The system was bigger than him, but he was the rot she could reach, the infection she could cut out before it spread further. She lunged. Mercer was fast, faster than she expected, but she had spent her life preparing for men like him. His first punch was meant to break her jaw, but she ducked under it, driving her knee into his ribs. He barely flinched, retaliating with a brutal elbow to her side, sending shockwaves of pain through her body. She spun with the momentum, using the force to drive her palm into his throat, making him stagger back just long enough for her to press the attack. But Mercer was a street fighter, a brawler with years of survival carved into his bones. He caught her wrist mid-swing, twisting it behind her back, wrenching her arm with enough force to make her gasp. Dorn struggled against his restraints, his muffled shouts drowned by the chaos around them. The Cobras watched in tense silence, waiting for their leader to finish the job. Mercer leaned in, his breath hot against Naomi's ear. "This is where your little crusade ends." She didn't think. She reacted. Her free hand shot forward, seizing the knife from his belt, and in one fluid motion, she drove it deep into his side. The air left Mercer's lungs in a single shocked exhale. His grip slackened, his eyes wide, disbelieving. Naomi didn't wait for him to recover. She tore the blade free and plunged it in again, twisting it, feeling the raw tremor of his body faltering. The cobras hesitated, watching their leader bleed, uncertain, afraid. She didn't stay to see the aftermath. In the split second of confusion, she cut Dorn loose, dragging him to his feet. His legs were weak, but his will was strong, and together, they ran. Bullets followed, ricocheting off metal, slicing through air, but Naomi didn't stop, didn't look back, even as Mercer's furious, broken scream echoed through the warehouse. They disappeared into the night, battered, bloodied, but alive. The death of Red Mercer sent shockwaves through the underworld, but the Black Cobras were like a wounded animal, desperate, unpredictable, and still dangerous. Without their leader, factions within the gang turned on each other, fighting for dominance while the city burned in their wake. Businesses were looted, cars torched, and bodies left in the streets as a message. They were still in control. Naomi knew better. The Cobras were crumbling, their foundation cracked beyond repair, but unless she finished this war, they would regroup, stronger and more ruthless than before. Mercer was never the real power. He was just a pawn. The true enemy sat in a government office, wearing a suit and signing orders that kept the city in chains. Congressman Daniel Olton. Naomi had spent nights digging, following money trails, listening to whispers from terrified informants. She knew the truth now. Olton wasn't just using the Cobras to silence his enemies. He was running a full-scale criminal operation, laundering millions through dummy charities, selling weapons through the gangs, and orchestrating hits on anyone who stood in his way. The police turned a blind eye because their pockets were lined with his money. The courts ignored evidence because the judges owed him favors. But Naomi had something he couldn't buy: proof. She needed to act fast. The city was reaching a breaking point, and the Cobras were lashing out. Dorn was still recovering, his body bearing the price of their last battle, but his mind was sharp. Together, they devised a plan. The files she had stolen, the encrypted messages, the financial records, it was enough to bring Olton down if it reached the right hands. She couldn't trust local authorities, not when half of them worked for him. This had to go higher. She leaked the files to federal investigators, journalists, and anti-corruption agencies all at once. The media exploded with the revelations. Every crime, every dollar siphoned from taxpayers, every violent order he had given was now public knowledge. Olton tried to deny it, calling it a smear campaign, blaming his political opponents, but the evidence was airtight. The world was watching. The feds moved fast. Naomi wasn't done. She wanted to see the fear in his eyes. She tracked him to his private estate outside the city, where he was making preparations to flee. The moment he saw her standing in his driveway, rain pouring down, her eyes burning with the fire of vengeance, his composure cracked. He knew he had lost. His security detail hesitated, conflicted, uncertain, unwilling to die for a man whose empire was crumbling. "You're finished," she said, her voice steady despite the storm around them. Olton sneered, but there was desperation in his eyes. "You think this changes anything? Another man will take my place. This system doesn't fall because of one scandal." "Maybe not," Naomi admitted. "But you do." As sirens filled the air, red and blue lights cutting through the darkness, Olton made a final, foolish move. He turned to run, but before he could even reach his car, the FBI agents swarmed in, guns raised, orders shouted. He was forced to the ground, hands wrenched behind his back, his expensive suit soaked in mud as the cameras rolled. The world watched as the king fell. And with him, the Cobras shattered. Leaderless, hunted by law enforcement, and betrayed by their own, the gang disintegrated overnight. Some fled, others turned on each other, and many ended up dead in the very streets they once ruled. The city of Riverfall, though scarred and battered, finally had a chance to heal. Naomi stood in the aftermath, bruised, exhausted, but victorious. The war was over. Riverfall was different now. The streets that once belonged to the Cobras were no longer filled with their colors, no longer patrolled by their foot soldiers demanding tribute for protection that never existed. The graffiti marking their territory had been painted over, the storefronts once boarded up out of fear were reopening, and for the first time in years, people walked without looking over their shoulders. The air still carried the weight of everything that had happened, the echoes of gunfire, the stains of blood, the memories of those lost, but the city was breathing again, slowly coming back to life. Yet for Naomi, the war had taken something from her that could never be restored. She stood in front of the clinic, the place where it all began, the place where she once believed she could save lives without having to fight for them. It had been rebuilt, the charred remains replaced with fresh walls, new windows, and a renewed purpose. Patients filled the waiting room, doctors moved between them, nurses hurried to their stations, but she was not among them. There was no place for her here anymore. Her presence was a reminder of what had happened, of the war fought in the streets, of the blood spilled to reclaim this small piece of safety. The staff welcomed her with gratitude, but she could see it in their eyes. They wanted to move forward, to leave the past where it belonged. Dorn found her outside, leaning against the railing, watching the world she had helped rebuild but could no longer be a part of. He looked better than he had in weeks, the bruises from his captivity fading, the weight of survival making him more resolute. He had been the only one who truly understood what it had cost her. He handed her a badge, a symbol of the fight continuing on another battlefield. "Come work for us," he said. "You've already done more than most cops ever could. We could use someone like you." She turned the badge over in her hands, feeling its weight, knowing what it represented. It was a path forward, a way to channel everything she had learned, every scar she carried, into something official, something with structure, something that would make sense of the chaos she had lived through. But that was the problem. The system had failed her before. It had allowed men like Olton to thrive, had turned a blind eye to the suffering of the innocent, had only stepped in when the truth had become too public to ignore. She had done what she did because she had no other choice. If she stepped into the system now, she would become part of it. She handed the badge back. "I appreciate it, but that's not me," she said. "Not anymore." Dorn sighed, nodding as if he had expected this answer. "So what now?" She looked past him, past the clinic, past the streets she had once called home, and saw nothing but roads leading away from it all. The blood on her hands, the ghosts of those she had failed, the weight of everything she had done. It wasn't something she could wash away by staying. The city would move on, but she couldn't. "Not here. I leave," she said. "I don't know where, but not here." There was no dramatic farewell, no grand exit, no final speech. She walked to her car, feeling the city's eyes on her, knowing this was the last time she would see these streets, this skyline, this world she had fought so hard to change. The war had been won, but she had lost herself in the process. The only thing left to do was walk away. Naomi started the engine, gripping the wheel as the city of Riverfall faded behind her. The skyline, once a prison of violence and corruption, now became a distant silhouette in her rearview mirror. The roads stretched endlessly ahead, each mile pulling her further from the ghosts of the past, from the blood she had spilled, from the war she had fought. The hum of the engine was steady, the asphalt beneath her tires an unbroken path to something new, something unknown. The weight that had pressed against her chest for years began to lift, not completely, not yet, but enough for her to breathe without the taste of iron and smoke lingering in her lungs. She drove without a destination, letting the world unfold around her. The highway stretched through open fields, winding past nameless towns and forgotten roads. For the first time in what felt like eternity, she wasn't running toward a fight or away from danger. She was simply moving, leaving behind the blood-stained city that had taken so much from her and demanded even more. The road signs changed, the names of places unfamiliar, detached from the violence of Riverfall. She could start over. She could be whoever she wanted to be. As dusk settled, she found herself in a small town nestled between rolling hills, a place untouched by the chaos she had lived through. It was quiet, the streets lined with old brick buildings, the kind of place where people knew each other's names, where the biggest problem was a late delivery or a broken street lamp. There were no cobras here, no corruption eating away at the foundation of the town, no battles waiting to be fought. It was strange, unsettling even, to be somewhere that didn't demand her strength, her rage, her relentless fight for justice. She pulled into the parking lot of a small roadside cafe, the neon sign buzzing softly in the twilight. Stepping inside, she felt out of place, A soldier without a battlefield, a warrior with no enemy left to fight. The scent of freshly brewed coffee and warm pastries filled the air, a stark contrast to the sterile hospital corridors and smoke-filled alleyways she had known. A waitress, probably no older than 20, approached with a genuine smile, holding a notepad in one hand, a coffee pot in the other. "What can I get you?" she asked, her voice light, unburdened. Naomi hesitated, then simply said, "Coffee?" The cup was placed before her, steam rising in delicate curls. She wrapped her hands around it, feeling the warmth seep into her fingers, into her skin, into the parts of her that had been numb for too long. She lifted it to her lips, the bitterness grounding her, reminding her that she was still here, still breathing, still alive. For the first time in years, there was no urgency, no threat lurking in the shadows, no enemy watching her from across the room. There was only this moment, simple, quiet, hers. She exhaled, long and slow, letting the past slip further away with every breath. The war was over. The fight was done. And though the scars would remain, though the memories would never fully fade, she was free. The road ahead was unwritten, the future hers to shape. Naomi Carter had spent her life fighting, but now, for the first time, she was ready to live.